Hi, I'm Bart Howard, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Viking TV. It is wonderful to be with you this evening, especially during Remembrance Week or Veterans Day in the United States. I'm joining you from Italy, of all places. I live just west of Naples. We're a military family. My wife works for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and we're surrounded by history, obviously, being in Italy, but we're also surrounded by history of the Second World War. Just about 45 minutes away from Salerno. Just up the road is the Volturno River. And just about an hour from us is Cassino, where some of the sites of the most important battles of the Italian campaign took place. This week is the 78th anniversary of what's called Operation Torch. And it's not one of the well-known operations. People seem to know a lot about D-Day, or they've seen the movie Dunkirk or recently Midway, and they're familiar with those battles, but they haven't heard of Torch. And Torch is an important operation, and it's where the U.S. forces, especially the United States Army and Navy, first entered combat in the European theater of operations. Of course, the United Kingdom had been in combat since 1939, but the Americans had come in December of 1941. And those first few months of the war, there was many decisions that had to be made. Where would U.S. forces first be used? And so tonight I'd like to talk to you about that operation, which became known as Operation Torch. We could go to the first slide. On November 8th, 1942, if you woke up in Boston and you saw the headlines, you'd say there's some sort of invasion in French Africa. Maybe one of your neighbors who had been drafted, one of your neighbors who was in the war, even your own family was in the Army or Navy. You might say maybe they are off the North African coast and wonder, what are they doing there? It came as a surprise to the American public, but it most importantly came as a surprise to Nazi Germany, to the enemy, because this was a great strategic surprise. There had been some intelligence, but the world was surprised that the United States and Great Britain could move 107 ships and over 100,000 soldiers to the coast of North Africa. We would be introduced to this man. Here we see him as just a young cadet at West Point, the class of 1915, the class that the stars fell on. There were so many generals. This young boy who came from Abilene, Kansas, just to play football at West Point, but later he would become one of the most famous generals of World War II, and he would lead these forces in Operation Torch. We would be introduced to General Patton, George Patton, who at this point was not that well known to the American public. He was known from the newspapers. He was on the cover of Life at one point, but he would really come to be known as a very famous general during Operation Torch and later. And there's other characters that you might not know that much. This is Brigadier General Teddy Roosevelt. You know Teddy Roosevelt, the President of the United States? His son, his namesake, was a great general in World War II, a tough soldier. Here he is with his Jeep, the Rough Rider, and he's a character that we see in this operation. But the battle really is a story of the United States military, how it had to learn to fight. Its leaders had to learn how to manage large forces. And these first battles, I'll have to tell you, are not something that the Army was very proud of. They made many mistakes, but what was most important is they learned from those mistakes. They got tougher, they got better, and that Army improved so that we see those type of forces that could land in D-Day and victory beyond. If you're interested in this type of history, I get no money from Mr. Atkinson. I've never met him. I'd love to, but this series of books, The Army at Dawn, Day of Battle, and Guns at Last Light, are some of the best books you can read on the Second World War, especially for the Allies, the American side of it. And the first book, Army of Dawn, is a lot of what I'm going to talk about this evening. But as background, we kind of have to go back before I can in Morocco and Algeria, we have to say, how did we get there? Now, remember, the war starts in 1939. The Nazis and the Russians, who have an alliance with one another, invade Poland. War is declared. There is a bit of a pause, though, at this time, what's known as the phony war in some circles. And then in the spring, Germany attacks into Denmark. They attack into Norway. And in May of 1940, the Great Battle of France begins. This is where we have blitzkrieg, this mechanized warfare, this speed and pace of warfare that the world had never seen. And French forces fall back. British forces, the British Expeditionary Forces, fall back. Many of you probably have seen the movie Dunkirk, and they're pushed back to Great Britain. Now, what happens to the French military? Well, they surrender, and they have a collaboration. And this is the source of a lot of pain, a lot of controversy. Who leads this government, this collaborative government? This is Marshal Pétain, the man on the top. He's one of the most famous generals of World War I. He would be like General Pershing, and he goes along with this organization of what's known as the Vichy government. Why Vichy? Because their capital of their seat of government is in the city of Vichy in southern France. Who is the deputy of this government? It is the Admiral of the Fleet, Darlan. He's in charge of the entire French Navy, a very large Navy, and he has the loyalty of a very aristocratic French Navy. Now, these two gentlemen, there's a lot of controversy over them. People accuse them of collaborating. People accuse them of making very bad decisions. Pétain believes that he's going to save France. The French at this point are left as a neutral country. Hitler doesn't want to deal with occupying southern France. He doesn't want to exert all these forces having to control it. And also, the French government has a large colonial force, which we'll take a look at. He doesn't want to have to administer that. And the Vichy French government will administer these millions of people that are throughout the world in these French colonies. Remember, the United States is not at war in 1940, and we maintain diplomatic relations with Vichy France. On the left, you see an elderly Marshal Pétain, and the gentleman on the right is Admiral Leahy, United States Navy. A lot of folks may not know, but he is the highest ranking military officer of the United States in World War II. He technically outranks Marshall. He technically outranks MacArthur. He is, in today's terms, we would call him the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff. He is very intimate with Roosevelt. In fact, he later, when his wife dies, he becomes a widow. He lives in the White House and has nearly daily contact with FDR. General Marshall never met with Franklin Delano Roosevelt alone. So it goes to show you what kind of influence he had. And here he was the ambassador appointed to Vichy so that we could keep track of what was going on. We always hoped that we could somehow turn the Vichy, that we could prevent them from helping the Hitler's regime, and eventually hope that they would fight with the Allies. As I talked about those colonies, if we look at a map of the Mediterranean, we see France, the Vichy French forces. They're in Algeria, French Morocco, and Tunisia. Those are very important areas. Just to their north is Franco's government. Remember the dictator Franco, who's, again, he is neutral, but he is obviously favors Hitler, but he's playing all sides at this point. We have Mussolini in Libya, Italian forces, and we have British forces in Egypt, Sudan, British forces in Transjordan, Vichy forces in Syria, and all the way down Italian forces in what's modern-day Somalia. So this is a very important stewing pot right here that the British are very concerned about. Now, I mentioned this very large French naval force. This force basically is neutral. It's located in Toulon, France, and it's located also in the colonies, specifically in Algeria and Morocco. There's such a large fleet that Churchill is worried that if the Nazis get a control of this fleet, this will be extremely dangerous. use this fleet perhaps against the British. Now, in one of the most controversial decisions, and a decision that Churchill finds very painful, British forces, naval forces go to Mers el Kebir in Algeria, and they give an ultimatum to the French. You can surrender your force, you can move it to the Caribbean and have it under the control of a neutral country like the United States, or you can scuttle your fleet, you can destroy it. The French make no decision. They're inactive. They don't know what to do. And finally, the British Royal Navy opens fire on the French, and over 1,000 French sailors are killed, and quite a number of Royal Navy sailors are killed when one of their ships explodes. And this is a lesser known event. Why is this important? It's important because we have to recognize that the Vichy French and the British are not friends. They've been historical enemies, but they've also been allies, specifically in the First World War, and then just recently fighting in France. But there is no love lost now. Later in September, there's unsuccessful fighting by the British to take over Dakar. There's fighting in Syria. And there is a campaign that's lesser known, the Battle of Madagascar, when British forces take Madagascar, which is a strategic location, and they fight the Vichy French, who actually resist. Now, Mussolini finally makes his move in North Africa in September of 1940. He pushes into Egypt, and he pushes the British force back because he's much larger, but then nothing really happens. They sit in the desert, and in December of 1940, General O'Connor, in a very brilliant campaign, pushes them all the way back in Libya, and over 100,000 Italian soldiers are taken as prisoner. Now we can kind of chuckle at this and say, boy, are they incompetent? Well, this is the U.S. Army in 1940 and 1941. We are still riding horses. We still have these outdated scout cars. We have a lot of work to do in 1940 and 41. We're training, but the U.S. military is not ready to take on German forces. We're also out of the war. It's hard to remember this. We keep kind of racing ahead to D-Day and victory in Europe. But in 1940, the United States is very strongly, public opinion, to stay out of the war, even during the Battle of Britain, even during the Battle of France. And this is because the American public is isolationist. They see this European war as something they don't want to be involved with. I really enjoy this picture of President Roosevelt. Here he is, probably in Warm Springs. He can't stand, obviously, and he drives around in this car, and he meets regular Americans, and he often would stop, talk to a farmer, and kind of get a feel what was going on. And that feel was the fighting in Europe was not very popular. The Italians, as I said, they collapse in Libya, so Hitler has to help Mussolini, and he sends forces. One of the men he sends that later we will deal with is General Erwin Rommel, a great military tactician, very bold, very aggressive, and his job is just to hold on to Libya, don't let British forces advance much farther. Well, that's not the way Rommel operates, and he unexpectedly attacks against the Commonwealth forces and pushes them all the way back again into Egypt. This campaign in North Africa is a very seesaw. It goes back and forth. Well, right when you think maybe the British forces are building up again with supplies, something always happens. In this case, Mussolini attacked into Greece. And when he attacked into Greece, the Greeks opposed him very strongly. And Hitler once again had to bail out Mussolini. And when he did that, it looked like Greece could collapse. And Churchill strongly believed that they should help Greece, help fight. And so he sent British forces. That, unfortunately, became a disaster. And there was another Dunkirk. So not much progress was made at that time. Then the world was shocked at Operation Barbarossa, Operation Redbeard. This is when Hitler attacks the Soviet Union. Now remember, Hitler and Stalin had a peace pact, basically neutrality that Stalin actually believed would hold. But all along, Hitler was looking for his opportunity to attack into the East. His real political fight was against communism. He knew he couldn't invade Great Britain at this point. He'd given up on that. This was the Battle of Britain and the very strong Royal Navy. But he believes if the USSR falls and he has all of Europe, then Great Britain would have to sue for peace. But as we know, his attack into USSR is the great mistake of the war. We know that because we can move ahead in time. But in 1941, it looked possible that the Russians could collapse. So on these dark days, the British counterattack in North Africa. This is the only place they can engage German forces. They can't engage them in France. And so they attack and they push Rommel back all the way again to the edge of Libya. Well, December 1941. Here is another surprise. When the Allies, the Axis, Japan, Germany, and fascist Italy, Japan attacks the United States. Well, we could have a whole different lecture about the reasons the Japanese did this. Was that a dumb gamble? Was it a gamble? Did they have any chance? Well, the main point is they saw the attack on Pearl Harbor as perhaps a way that the Americans would eventually negotiate. Of course, we know this was a huge miscalculation. But what does it mean? It means that the Americans are now in the war with both feet. And in February of 1942, there is even the fall for the British in the Pacific, the fall of Singapore, the great fortress of Singapore, the sinking of the Prince of Wales, and here is the surrender of General Percival outside the Ford factory in Singapore in February of 1942. On a Viking cruise, I have been to that very spot. I've been to where that painting was, and it is very moving. Of course, I always drag the family around when we're in these locations and say, I've got to go and see these certain places. Now, what about Germany and Italy? Remember, we declared war against Japan, the famous Day of Infamy speech that Roosevelt gave. But Germany and Italy declare war on the United States on the December 10th. And so we are thrust into the war in Europe without even making that decision. There is one of those other what ifs of history. What if the German and Italians had not declared war? Would Congress have gone along with that? Or would we have stayed with only a Japan-only war? Those are the unponderables. But in December 10th, we are definitely in both a European and a Japanese war. Now, many of you know Churchill. A lot of my friends on the cruise love to read about Churchill. Churchill actually says he gets a good night's sleep because he knows now the Americans are in the war. Of course, the war isn't won, but with the industrial might of the United States and the Commonwealth, victory has a chance. Well, what is his first actions? What does Churchill do? First, he goes to Washington immediately. This is called the Arcadia Conference, and he must convince. Here's a wonderful photo of him and FDR, these great friends. He must convince Roosevelt that they will fight Germany first. Roosevelt agrees to that, and so does General Marshall, the leader of the United States Army. They understand that the Nazi Germany, Hitler and his regime, are the greatest danger to civilization at that point. Of course they will fight the Japanese, but the preponderance of men, equipment, and material will go to help the Russians and the British and the Americans as they fight in the European theater of operations. Now, this photo of FDR and Churchill, boy, there's great stories about these two men, very fascinating. I love to tell stories of what I've read about them, of their relationship. You know, both of them are charismatic. Both think that they're getting over on the other, and rightfully so. They both have their self-interest. But at the end of the day, isn't it wonderful that we had these two great statesmen lead the forces in this great calamity? So the strategic priority in 1942 will be leader of the army, as I said, George Marshall. He agrees with that. But what he doesn't agree is, how do you do that? He believes immediately, as soon as we can, perhaps at the end of 1942, we should attack directly into the heart of Germany. This is called Operation Roundup, or early 1943. Don't go anywhere on a periphery. Bring as many soldiers and material as we can to the United Kingdom and attack into the heart of Germany. Well, this is not realistic. I mean, we know this now, and the British knew this, but the Americans needed some convincing. We don't have the ships. We don't have the amphibious ships built. All of our factories are gearing up. We did have a number of months where we were already building ships, but we didn't have them completed. And ships and material, men are the same way. All these young men in the United States that are drafted and joined, they have to be trained, equipped. An army cannot take the field without having proper training. Marshall's counterpart, Field Marshal Brooke, who has to handle Churchill, just like Marshall has to handle Roosevelt. The British believe in a different approach. This is what's called the indirect approach. This is what's called, when Churchill says, the soft underbelly of Europe. He doesn't mean it'll be easier going through Southern Europe. He just says, if you were to attack a crocodile, would you attack it through the snout where the teeth are, or would you try to go through the belly? And what the British argue, based on their experience of the First World War, of the horrors of the trenches, is go indirect. Perhaps Mussolini's Italy will collapse. Perhaps they can move through the Balkans in conjunction with the Russians, who they believe that they can hold on and build up, they will attack from a different direction. And this is all found in Eisenhower's Armies, a great book. People ask me, what books are you reading or read on this subject? Here is a great book on how the British and American alliance work together. Now, one of the key people in all of this, we don't know about him yet, but here's youngish, 52-year-old Dwight Eisenhower, a great staff officer. He's brought into the Pentagon. He's not well known. He was a major for like 13 years. He works for Marshall, but he's quickly going to raise in rank because he's an excellent staff officer and he has the qualities Marshall sees of this new future army. Couple of notes, though. What's going on in the Pacific during this time? Well, sadly, in the beginning, in the spring of 1942, the Philippines will fall. The Japanese are highly successful in moving. General Wainwright and the garrison of Corregidor will have to surrender. This is very, very tough. This is what starts the infamous Bataan Death March. And then for the next 3 years, these poor soldiers are prisoners or they perish at the hands of the enemy. What saves the Pacific Campaign at this time, though, is the Battle of Midway. You know, I know the movie came out a few months ago, and I wouldn't comment too much about all the historical accuracy of it. But what it does bring out is that even though we might have known some of the code of the Japanese and we knew they were moving towards Midway, it took incredible bravery, luck, and heroism to take those dive bombers and torpedo bombers and sink those Japanese carriers. And by doing that, they saved time in the Pacific, and we could focus on the European theater. The Japanese advance, its high watermark was Midway, and then they would be pushed back. So in Europe, wow, now we see Lieutenant General. He's now a 3-star. Eisenhower is sent to England with his deputy, Major General Mark Clark, who, just as a side note, I remember being a young cadet in the Army in 1980 and seeing an elderly man in a Jeep with white hair. And it was General Mark Clark. He drove right past me. And I think, wow, I actually saw him, one of the great generals of World War II. Now, they're in England for the great buildup. This is when all the GIs begin to invade the United Kingdom. This is the any gum chum, the over here, under Eisenhower, all those jokes that go on. But they are going to build up that force, and they have to build up quickly, because in June of 1942, as the seesaw battle is going between Rommel and British General Garrison Brook surrenders. This is a great loss to the British military. In fact, Churchill is in the White House when this happens, and is one of the dark moments. He covers his head after he reads the telegram, and Roosevelt says, "What can we do to help?" In fact, what we do is we immediately send hundreds of our newest tank to help with the British, and by the time they're used is the Battle of El Alamein. So a decision has to be made. We're now into August of 1942. What has the American force done in Europe? Technically nothing to this point except the Battle of the Atlantic, the movie with Tom Hanks, right? Greyhound. We're helping to fight the U-boat war, but we haven't had decisive action. Well, all militaries have plans on the books. They're always looking at different options. One of the options was called gymnast, and Roosevelt and Churchill like this idea. And the idea is, how about if we land on the west of Africa, in Morocco and Algeria, where the Vichy French are, because they're starting to get indicators that the Vichy French, maybe they would collaborate. Maybe if there's an American force land there, these traditional allies, perhaps there's enough collaboration. Perhaps some of the military will not fight their old friend, the Americans. Maybe we can get a lodgment, we can push, and then on the other side of North Africa, there's a small picture of Montgomery there. Montgomery pushes, and they both meet in Tunisia. They come on each side. Well, General Marshall does not like this plan. He is animate that this will take away from the main effort of getting into the heart of Germany. But Roosevelt is very pragmatic for two reasons. One, he doesn't believe we're ready to attack. Two, he sees this as getting in with less risk. We can land in Morocco. The Vichy French are not the crack German army. And also, quite realistically, there's an election coming up in November of 1942, and he wants that midterm election to be able to say he's done something. So the great sledgehammer operation is put on hold once again, and they begin what's called Operation Torch. They only have about 90 days to plan it. Can you imagine? No laptops, no Zoom, no big computers crunching everything. This is all done by paper. And they have to get 100,000 men from both Virginia, Norfolk, Virginia, all the way from the US, and forces all the way from Great Britain to attack in Morocco and Algeria. The Vichy French have almost 100,000 both colonial soldiers and regular soldiers there. They have some naval forces, to include a battleship that is partially completed, and destroyers and submarines, and a fairly significant and manned air force. So it's not something that they can just walk on. They also have to contend with Spain. They're very, very worried about Franco, the dictator Franco. He's playing both sides. He's in communication with the Germans. He's also in communication with the Americans, and they're very worried that he will take Gibraltar. I'm sure some of you have on your trips, if you've made it down to Gibraltar, it's fascinating to see this little carved out portion. Even today, it's still controversial that the British control this. If they cut off Gibraltar, that's a problem. Thankfully, Franco's not a great guy, but he's a pragmatist, and he always plays all his options. And the Germans never come in from occupied France into Spain, so that never happens. This operation, they keep emphasizing, it must be an American operation. Although there will be British ships and some British soldiers, the preponderance of the soldiers will be from this green American army, wearing bold American flags marked on their tanks, because they know that there is a historical relationship with the French. And perhaps these allies that we had will not want to fight, and will have a common enemy against Germany. There's three forces, one in Morocco under George Patton, who you've probably heard about, a center task force under a general named Friedenau, who I'm sure you've not heard about, he's very unknown, and an Eastern Task Force under a division commander named General Ryder. So they're going to land simultaneously. Very bold operation. Morocco, Oran, Algeria. The naval plan is complicated, and it is quite a tribute to the United States Navy and the Royal Navy that they do. Spoiler alert, they get everyone to generally the right spot. I mean, these are hundreds of ships. They navigate and get there. And there's a U-boats that are operating, and the only a few incidents of U-boats off Algeria. But that force that came from Virginia, they're able to cross undetected. In fact, if there is someone you should know about, it is Rear Admiral Kent Hewitt, the man on the right, working with General Patton on that great mission. Now, Patton was very hard to get along with. In fact, Marshall has to pull him aside. You could almost argue Patton almost was fired because he couldn't get along with the Navy. He was very irascible, and Admiral Hewitt did everything that he could to get this operation going. If you're interested in those stories, this is the best book, I think, the best readable book. It's a classic. Admiral Morrison, the official historian of World War II for the Navy. He's got I think it's 14 volumes, but volume 2 is very readable and covers this. So here's General Eisenhower again. Here he is. He is this commander of this operation. He's never commanded any soldiers in battle. He's never commanded really anything over a battalion, but he's the consummate staff officer. He's worked in Washington. He knows his way around the Pentagon, and he knows how to work with the Allies. But all of Operation Torch is going to be up to these young soldiers. Now look at this soldier in the center. This is the Center Task Force. That corporal right there looks all of 15 to me. He's probably 18, 19 years old. Incredible. There's more political intrigue in Operation Torch than almost any other operation in World War II. We have a man named Daniel Murphy who works for the State Department. He's an operative. He's on the ground. He's talking to the Vichy. He knows there's folks that are liable to come over to the Allied side. They are talking to him. There's intrigue. He drinks coffee and tea with them in Algeria. There's Admiral Darlan, who I talked about, the deputy, the military commander of the Vichy. He's given some indications that maybe he would sway either way, but he's a very tricky character. And then there's the real fighters, those that don't like Vichy French and are asked, if we invade or we can put military force, will you come with us? One of those men is General Girard, who actually fought in May of 1940, was captured, escapes, and is living in southern France, and he is part of basically the underground. Right before the operation takes place in November, Murphy is really picking up feelers from a general Mast in Algiers that maybe the whole operation could occur without any fighting if they can turn the Vichy French forces, because most of them, he believes, will fight. General Clark, in a very interesting mission that is written about in the magazines later, he goes in a submarine and they go to Algiers. They literally go to a little house near a beach. At one point, they hide in a wine cellar because a little patrol goes by. And they basically get the information that for the most part, Girard would go along with this and that they should get a better reception. Still tough to make that call, but they get some good news, and Clark goes back. It's an incredible operation that in the middle of the night he gets back into this submarine and they go back to Gibraltar. This same famous plucky submarine goes to the south of France, picks up General Girard, and brings him to Gibraltar. Now, kind of a farce in all of this is they pretend they're an American submarine because Girard would not get on a British submarine, but it doesn't work very well. They don't look or act like Americans. Girard gets to the musty tunnels of Gibraltar, links up with General Eisenhower. Now, Eisenhower is not very happy when Girard announces that he understands he will be the supreme commander for the entire operation. Oh, the headaches Eisenhower has to go through. So you see on his desk there, he smokes 3 or 4 packs of cigarettes a day, one after another, drinks 15 cups of coffee a day, and they have to put General Girard to the side for a little bit. This is the tough political atmosphere that Eisenhower has to work with. All these free French forces, such as de Gaulle back in the United Kingdom, who is not necessarily informed about this because he's irascible, they all don't get along. Now, the actual operation. So finally, they make it on the evening of the 7th and 8th, the morning of the 8th, they're landing. They land. Now, this is a picture during the day. It's pitch black. The sea is very choppy on some of the beaches. They get into these small boats. Many of the boats go to the wrong spot. Many of the boats flounder once they hit the beach and are no longer usable. They lose a lot of boats in this. Many men are just not trained. They just didn't have enough training. They didn't have enough time, nor would they, because the weather by December would have been too rough for the winter and the operation would have been called off. Here's a picture of them landing on the beach in Morocco. This is not Saving Private Ryan. There wasn't major forces on the beaches. For the most part, they got on board. And for the most part, there was sporadic fighting in each one of the locations, some tougher than others. I'll go through just very quickly. We won't go through a lot of detail, but just to give you a snapshot. In Algiers, the principal city, the city that had the largest and most important port and population, General Ryder is flagged to the left, and that little patch of that cattle head is the 34th Infantry Division, and some British soldiers. The main British soldiers that landed in Operation Torch were in Algiers. They land, and within approximately a day, there is a peace settlement. General Mast is on the location, and they are able to make a ceasefire, and that it saves a lot of bloodshed. Unfortunately, they tried to rush the harbor, what was called terminal force, on these destroyers that were going to land right in, and those soldiers were captured, but later they were free. But this huge political maze comes out in Algiers. Girard arrives by plane from Gibraltar, but he's not greeted as a liberator. The French are unsure of him. There's still the wranglings. Admiral Darlan, in one of the great twists of this whole story, happens to be in Algeria, visiting his son who has polio. Well, he's in charge of all of military forces of Vichy France. General Clark arrives to now settle this argument and tell the French, we must get along. Call a ceasefire, we can work together. Girard says, I can't operate. He's outranks me. And Clark becomes so angry. He draws them into a room. They tell from firsthand account he's pounding on a desk. He threatens to arrest Darlan. And finally, Darlan agrees to a ceasefire, but he only controls the local Algerian area. It will take him approximately 72 hours to get ceasefiring across the entire theater. Pétain, who knows his head's on the block with Hitler, says, I don't agree with this, and he fires Darlan, says, Darlan, you're no longer the deputy of Vichy France. Darlan realizes he has no options anymore, and he finally convinces everyone. He seems to be the only person that does have authority to end the fighting. So in this strange marriage now, Darlan, the former collaborator, becomes the political leader, and Girard now is the military leader of these newly liberated French forces in North Africa. Well, as I'll talk about in just a minute, Germany, this is the last straw. They will invade Vichy and they will invade into Tunisia. Unfortunately, in Tunisia, the Allies are not there. Their plan was to move into Tunisia, but the German forces move in power. Now, all of this takes place, this Darlan deal, which is there was a lot of political wrangling and some bad press over this because Darlan was not a popular figure. Occurs in the Hotel Saint Georges in Algiers. The picture on the left is the hotel, and I took that picture on a Viking cruise. We actually were in Algiers and we took a tour group and we talked about this actual operation and sat in the room where Mark Clark and Darlan shook hands. In Oran, there was more fighting than in Algiers. There is an attack that goes directly into the harbor with these two ships. It is a suicide mission. Unfortunately, heavy casualties. In every location, some French units realized they were American and didn't want to fight. Others fought because it was their orders to fight. They followed their orders as soldiers. And unfortunately, there was heavy bloodshed in what was called Operation Reservist. On the right side, that little green and red, the 1st Infantry Division, a division that I had the honor to command a brigade in, under General Terry Allen, and on the left side, General Roosevelt. They have fighting over about a 48-hour period, and eventually they're able to go into Iran and there is a ceasefire, but there is bloodshed. Now, if you look just south of Iran, there's an airfield. Just one mission I'd like to mention is the first use of American paratroopers, the 2nd Battalion of the 509th. The Geronimo unit. This is where we get the term Geronimo when you jump out of something. They take off in this extremely ambitious idea to fly over 1,000 miles with no modern navigation equipment. And they're blown off course by strong crosswinds and bad navigation and a bad homing signal. And none of the paratroopers reach where they're supposed to be. Very bad start for the paratroopers. In the last area I'll talk about, in Casablanca in Morocco, this is under General Patton, there's some significant fighting that goes on there. The troops land just to the north in Fadala, and they will move their way down into Casablanca. Casablanca is an old city. It's got some ancient walls there and strong fortifications, and there's some fighting. And while they're there, the French fleet, the Vichy French, they, actually not knowing who's attacking, move what ships they can out into the Atlantic Ocean, and an old-fashioned naval battle takes place. We're talking with battleships like the USS Massachusetts, which fires almost half of their rounds, 16-inch. There's French submarines, there's torpedoes exchanged. On the bottom left, the unfinished battleship Jean Bart fires a number of rounds before it's disabled in an old-fashioned battleship exchange. And the biggest aircraft carrier, and the only major carrier that the U.S. sends, they sent smaller ones, but the only big ones, such as the Enterprise and such, the USS Ranger operates off that shore. So it's an actual naval operation. During all of this, Patton is watching this battle. There's guns going off on the ship he's on, the USS Augusta, as they fire at these different French ships approaching them. And the boat that he had all of this, kind of a funny story, the boat that he had all of his personal gear on, it fell off the ship and it sank immediately. And he looked at it, and the only thing he had was his ivory-handled pistols, and every stick of clothing he had fell into the ocean. And he looked at his aide and he said, "I sure hell hope you have a toothbrush, because the Navy just lost everything for me." Patton is in his perfect form. He eventually gets onto the beach of Morocco and he drives people. In fact, he says he lands to flay the idle, rebuke the incompetent, and drive the timid. Pure Patton. Just to the north in Port Laioti, there's a major airfield that has to be taken. And just a couple of notes there. They use small light tanks, are able to land and operate, and they have a bit of a tank battle. But what's very interesting is they send a destroyer right up the river towards this airfield with soldiers on board. This USS Dallas is piloted by a former French free Frenchman who escapes Morocco, gives his services to the Allies. He knows the port, and he moves the ship, navigates it very boldly up the channel, and the USS Dallas is awarded a Presidential Unit Citation, a big thing to the U.S. Navy, and he is rewarded a Silver Star. In fact, there's 2 medals of honor for this fight, one to a Major Hamilton, who spoke perfect French, had lived in Paris for a while, and another to a Colonel Craw. They were going to take letters to the French general in Morocco to try to parley with him, to try to avoid bloodshed. Unfortunately, Colonel Craw was shot. He was shot at a checkpoint, probably accidentally, because the French apologized after and said it was very unfortunate. So Colonel Craw dies, but Major Pierpoint Hamilton's able to get the word that they want to talk. Eventually, it all works out, but not immediately. Now, I tell this story because the connections we get when we're on Viking cruises. I had a gentleman come up to me after a talk similar to this, and he said, I never heard of Colonel Craw, but when I was a young college student in 1961, I worked for a Mrs. Craw, who was an elderly, very wealthy widow, and her husband had earned the Medal of Honor, and that must be him. And it was a powerful moment. I said, you know, this person actually existed. There was heavy fighting back and forth for at least 48 hours. One of the places was the Casbah, the famous Casbah by Casablanca area. Eventually, though, in the south near Safi, they made a landing in Safi. It was very successful. Fortunately, not a lot of fighting, and they were there because there was nowhere to land tanks. They didn't have any amphibious ships that could land tanks directly on shore, and they had to pick 55 of them one by one off the ship. But fortunately, within 72 hours, there is peace. And they said, one of the historians, Rick Axon, in fact, says it was almost like a marital spat between the French and the Americans. No doubt, over 1,000 soldiers on both sides are killed, wounded. There is death. But within 72 hours, they said it was strange because how quickly the now liberated Vichy French would work with the Americans. Here's a perfect example. Patton working with the French general in charge of forces in Morocco. You know, Patton spoke fluent French. He really admired the French military, had served very close with them in World War I, went to some of their cavalry schools, and he was very good in this role. You can see he worked very well with the French. Here's a picture of all this intrigue. Eisenhower. Look Eisenhower's not happy in this photo. Darlan with the smirk. Clark towering over him at his all 6'5" frame. And then Murphy, the State Department intriguer, smiling. Well, at least they got the forces to stop fighting. As I said before, though, what did the price they pay for this? Vichy France was occupied, and now all of France is under Nazi occupation. In fact, the French fleet scuttles. It destroys itself in November 1942. So the threat of any of the French fleet is now gone. And we see much more of the rise of the Free French forces of the interior. This is the underground. By December, in a strange move, a loyalist, a French monarchist of all things, assassinates Darlan, and Darlan is out of the picture, much to the relief of Eisenhower. There's always a lot of intrigue who did this. but I believe all the historians agree it was an internal, some sort of an internal job. The Allies didn't coordinate it. In January of 1943, there's the Casablanca Conference. They meet in Morocco, decide on the future of the war. And one of the big moves in Casablanca is that General Gérard and now General de Gaulle, always this intrigue. No one seems to get along. They finally agree that the free French forces, under a new flag, we see the Cross of Lorraine, and it's hard to see in the photo, but Roosevelt is smiling, Churchill's smiling. The free French forces will be equipped with American equipment, and they will fight for the rest of the war side by side with the Allies. Now, the aftermath, though, in Tunisia is, sadly, the aim of taking all of North Africa falls, because by December of 1942, the rains start and the weather starts, and the British, American, and Free French forces are not able to take Tunisia because a large German force moves in. Hitler decides to fight in North Africa, in Tunisia. And now the war will go on for a number of more months. Here's the Africa Corps, the Panzer Army Africa. They're reinforced, they're tough, and the Americans fight. It's an American-British fight, but primarily the Americans take heavy losses in what's called the Battle of Kasserine Pass. And this is where we see the amateurishness of the American army. These young soldiers are not tough enough to take on the Panzer Army Africa. They will have to learn how to fight. If you're interested in that operation, a great book by Martin Blumenson. It's an older book, but it is definitely describes the battle in an easy, readable book. Now, General Friedenthal, who you've probably not heard of, and you wouldn't, because he fades away, and General Patton takes charge of that corps and builds it back up and starts to build the American army better and better. Just as a side note, Patton's son-in-law, Lieutenant Colonel John Walters, is captured during the Battle of Kasserine Pass, and he is held prisoner till 1945. I served 30 years in American Armor during the operations in Tunisia. They're too brave. They attack recklessly, and they have to learn how to fight against the German panzers. American infantry learn. In some cases, they ran. In other cases, they held strong. But these young men here, as you see in this picture, all of 19 years old, all teenagers probably, they will learn how to fight. American artillery, though, is probably the hero of the end of Tunisia. They really are impressive, and in almost all cases, the infantry and armor has to rely on the artillery to bail them out. As a final note, we see guys like Omar Bradley, Truscott, they begin to rise up in Operation Torch, and they become generals that you can rely upon, and they will be given more and more responsibility. It takes from April to May to finally take out the German and Italian forces left in North Africa. But when that happens in May, there is over 150,000 POWs. It's one of the greatest victories of World War II. At the same time, just Stalingrad is falling. So now we're seeing the turn when the Axis forces are really, the war is going to start to turn. Here's a picture of Life magazine of the POWs, the German POWs in North Africa. If you could see really closely, there's not a lot of frowns. They're glad to be out of the war. You might have seen them, or relatives have say that they saw these same POWs in Iowa or Colorado or New Mexico on a farm. And that's where that photo is. By 1943, all of Africa is now in the Allies' hands. They will make a decision to continue. They're not ready for attacking into D-Day in France, so they take Sicily, Salerno, and they will work up Italy, which is a briefing for another day, the Italian campaign. A couple of notes. Boy, we could have used ships like this, the landing ship tank in Operation Torch, but they would learn so much. They made many mistakes on how to load their ships, how to do logistics. Fortunately, because we were fighting the Vichy French, those mistakes were not capitalized on. Even General Truscott said, if we had been fighting a German army in Morocco and Algeria, it would have been a very different story. Here are supplies in Morocco. It was a mess, absolute mess of supplies. And Patton, as good as a soldier he was a terrible logistician, and he made many mistakes. But again, as I said, they would have to learn how to deal with this. But who else learned? Eisenhower learned. Some big mistakes were made. Probably should have pushed harder to get into Tunisia earlier. Eisenhower had to spend 90% of his time on political issues and not those tactical issues. But what was important is this staff, this coalition staff of British, American, Commonwealth officers worked together for one aim, and that was to defeat Axis forces. And the last, and the reason that we talk about Remembrance Week is we think about these young men. In this case, they're American young men. They're tankers. These young men, all of 19, all of 20 years old, probably from all parts of the United States, Wisconsin, New York, Texas, Oklahoma, they would have to learn to fight. And they were the ones that bore the brunt of this Operation Torch. So at this point, that is Operation Torch. And I am going to go where we can take some questions from Heather.
Thank you, Bart. We've had some lovely comments come in. I'll start with one we've received from Linda Johnson in Roanoke in the United States. She says, "This has been so informative and interesting. I love World War II history and appreciated every moment and learned so much. Thank you."
Oh, thank you.
We have a comment come in from Mark Snedden in Littleton. First of all, he would like to say thank you for the interesting discussion and also thank you for your service. He asks, what were the repercussions to the Vichy French at the end of the war? Is this shaky history to reason there remained a huge misrepresentation of our relationship with France that existed for years after the war?
Well, I would say, many of them were brought to trial and some were literally given death sentences. They spared Marshal Pétain because he was an old man, and eventually, he was such a figure to deal with. This was the challenge, and it's still, it's a tough history to talk about today with French because, again, there were folks that collaborated, and we see this in Operation Dragoon when finally they land in southern France. And the French take revenge on people that had collaborated. I think, though, what's interesting is how the Americans, specifically because of Roosevelt and that relationship we had with France that was different from UK, they always kept their finger in of talking, for example, Admiral Leahy being the ambassador. And what happened is what we wanted to achieve, and the fighting with Vichy France was not, it was only 72 hours or so. And many of the soldiers then turned and fought for the Free French. So that was achieved. And the Free French forces, it's really overlooked. They really were equipped and they fight very well in Italy. Very brave. I mean, it must have been very tough to be separated from your country, not your country's occupied, maybe family members, just like the Poles fought very, very bravely under such tough circumstances.
Thank you, Bart. Another question from Jerry Fiesel in Kent in the United States. He says, my recently deceased brother was a veteran of the 12th Armoured Division under Patton. What are the most important and decisive battles that the 12th was involved in?
Oh, the 12th was not in this operation, and I'd have to check on the 12th. They came in later in the war, probably around 45, maybe even after the Battle of the Bulge. We built I think it was up to 16 armored divisions. So it was incredible. But that's why I love being on board, because then we would connect. I had a great member of the audience once tell me their uncle was in Tunisia and was killed, and he wanted to know more. He didn't really know what happened. And I was able to find out that his uncle received the Silver Star, which is this very significant valor award. And I was able to piece together exactly what that is. So those are very powerful. So I appreciate fighting there, but that wasn't Operation Torch. The 12th Armored was later in the war.
Thank you. A question from Brian Sporer in San Francisco. He says, I just learned that 20 million Russians died in World War II, and that the Germans redeployed so many of their troops from Normandy to the Eastern Front that the German defence lines of northern France were weakened, and D-Day became a success. Is this the case? If so, like, the war could have ended very differently had it not been for the Russians.
Oh, absolutely, in the sense that the Russians, there is no doubt and there's no controversy of saying the Russians took the brunt of the fighting in the Second World War. And that's because Stalin, quite brutally, was not that concerned with the loss of manpower. And they were a steamroller. And they fought the brunt of Nazi ground forces. Now, what isn't always known is how much equipment that we gave. We gave aircraft, trucks, different types of material that were sent to the Russians under the Lend-Lease program. And they probably would have had significant problems without that. So you would think they were thankful for that, but there's no doubt we could not have handled fighting Nazi Germany if Hitler. That's the question. If Hitler had never invaded Russia and Stalin was happy to just let him stay there, it would have been very tough. How would we have gotten into France? There were weaker forces in France, but enough forces that it wasn't a walkthrough to get through Normandy, and it wasn't a walkthrough to fight up Italy in the Italian campaign.
Thank you. We have some other nice comments which have come through. Susan in Las Vegas says, thank you, sir, for making learning about World War II so vivid and interesting. Thank you for your service. Thank you. Likewise, Joe Krim in Athens, United States says, thank you for your service. And Richard in Lady Lake, United States says, an excellent presentation. I'm a history buff, but this was very enlightening. Thank you for your service. On to another question now from Wallace Craig in Midland in the United States. He says, my dad fought under General Mark Clark in Italy. My brother Mark was named after him. He wonders why General Clark didn't advance further.
Oh, General Clark was the youngest 4-star general in World War II, so he was extremely successful. He went from being the 5th Army commander to the 15th Army Group. Later, he was the United Nations commander in Korea. So he became a 4-star general. He's not. In some circles, he's not as well known. I'm thinking, this isn't a prop, but I've got some books on Mark Clark. He's a very interesting character, very interesting. A little bit disliked. He was a real publicity hound. And today we would say he was a little too conscious of his career. He was smart and he could have done it without that, but his peers even were very suspicious of that. But he definitely succeeded in rank in World War II.
Thank you. A question from Gregory Carlo in Venice in the United States. He says, my father landed with General Patton. Where did they go after Casablanca? My father continued with the 5th Army and then in France until 1946. Thank you.
Well, that would be tough, but he probably, if he landed in Morocco, he could have been in, for example, the 3rd Infantry Division. They eventually moved into Tunisia, and then forces, once all of North Africa was secure, the next major operation was landing in Sicily. This was Operation Husky. And then from Sicily, some forces went into Salerno or up into Italy. And if they were in Italy for the rest of the war, there's different units that were there. But, you know, it's some soldiers literally landed in Morocco and were in for the duration of the war. And other soldiers were still training in the United States and didn't make it to get into the war till late. So, for example, the 1st Infantry Division, a unit, they're behind me, unit I'm near and dear to, they were in the whole war from start to finish for the Americans.
Thank you. Richard Gasparini in the United States asks if you could please provide a little bit more background on Teddy Roosevelt Jr. He'd like to know about his performance before and after World War II. Was he a professional soldier?
Oh, it's a great story. So Teddy Roosevelt Jr., who was, boy, it must have been tough to have your dad as one of the toughest he-men of the world. Teddy Roosevelt's quite a character. I really recommend watching the Ken Burns documentary on PBS on the Roosevelts, specifically on Teddy Roosevelt, and they talk about him, Ted Jr. In the First World War, he fought. Didn't have to, but he went. And in fact, he was wounded. I believe he was gassed and had some shell fragments and things, and he recovered from that. He was a successful businessman. And was worth some money. And then as the war was looking apparent in the Second World War, he comes back in, achieves the rank of a brigadier general, and he's older. He's in his 50s, which is considered old for a soldier in those days. He is with the 1st Infantry when they land in Algeria. He has arthritis, but he's driving around in the front, encouraging, kind of a Patton character, except he was more beloved. And he, in fact, was a little too rowdy, and he was punished a bit because him and General Terry Allen were seen as just a little too rowdy, a little too hard drinking. They let their soldiers get away with murder in the 1st Infantry Division. And so he goes out of the division, goes to what's called the 4th Division. He is the first general officer to land on D-Day. He lands on Utah Beach. He does it again. He's walking around with his walking stick, encouraging soldiers. Come on, son, let's go. He earns the Congressional Medal of Honor, which his father earned due to the battles in the Spanish-American War. And he dies of a heart attack on the 4th of July, 1944. And at his funeral, his pallbearers include Patton, I think Omar Bradley, and some very other famous generals. And he's buried at the D-Day Cemetery off Omaha Beach. That's not where he fought. He fought in Utah. But his grave is the most popular. People go see that. And I remember one time when I was in the military, we were escorting some VIPs in Europe. And on the manifest, the man that sat next to me was Theodore Roosevelt IV. And I had to say, I said, sir, was Teddy Roosevelt your great-grandfather and grandfather? And he said, yes, they were. And that was quite moving to me to be at least part of that generation, but a great soldier.
Thank you. Janice Hughes asks, she says, thank you for your interesting presentation. My deceased stepfather was in Tunisia in an operation with the 5th Army. He was water procurement for the troops. He said there was fighting, but he never said anything about how they obtained water. Do you have any background on what might have been involved with the day-to-day needs of the soldiers during that part of the war?
He probably fought in Italy. The 5th Army was formed to fight into the Battle of Salerno. And water purification is absolutely necessary. all of these areas that the soldiers would go into, and you're moving in 100,000 soldiers at a certain point, or in the Battle of Salerno, there's thousands and thousands of soldiers. All of the water is contaminated. There's disease, cholera. There's been fighting. It's quite horrible. And so they had units that could take water, and they filtered the water. They added chlorine and things. The troops never really, I've experienced chlorinated water. It won't hurt you, but it's not very tasty. But it's absolutely necessary, because the worst thing that can happen to an army is for it to have contaminated water, and then soldiers get sick. The majority of soldiers in World War II were not carrying a rifle and fighting every single day. The majority of soldiers were providing so that other soldiers could fight. It took cooks, medical personnel, logistics, ammunition, what's called the tail. And it may sound unglamorous, but it's extremely important to the military. So what he did was important.
Thank you. And a similar question about life for the soldiers from Susan Johnson. She says, during downtime in North Africa, what did the American military do to relax? Was that even possible? What was a life without fighting like? And she also says she must get on a trip where you are a speaker.
Oh, thank you. Most of the time they were not fighting. On any given day, they were not fighting. They were allowed to go into some of the local towns. For example, in North Africa, it was extremely exotic for these soldiers to see, the Bedouins, to see women dressed in these traditional costumes, men drinking tea and sipping coffee, but also, to be honest, in some places, there was a lot of drinking going on. There was, things where soldiers did get into trouble. But for the vast majority, there really wasn't that much to do. They would say they were bored. The Red Cross shows and things did come out, but it was such a vast area in North Africa. Movies were very popular. They tried to get movies and set up inside a tent or outside at night, but for the most part, it was boring. The average soldier would tell you that, and there was no telephones. Mail was extremely important. The mail service still worked. It's incredible. It might have taken a couple of weeks or so to get mail back, but they made every effort that soldiers had mail, books, magazines, and things of that nature.
Thank you. Another personal question from Alan Clampmeyer in the United States. He says, thank you for the presentation. My father-in-law was at Casablanca flying an OS-2U from the battleship USS Massachusetts. He was then, I think, captured. And Alan asks, do you know of any documentation of prisoner of war locations in Casablanca?
From what I would say, what I've read, and they did have pilots that were shot down. The OS-2 was a scout plane. There were Wildcats. They were a fighter. As far as I know, almost all of the prisoners were prisoner for only a few days, because the Vichy, who then immediately became Allied, and their own generals and admirals said, they exchanged prisoners on both sides. So I don't know of any prisoners that were ever sent to the German forces. That happened in Tunisia, where they fought the German and Italian. But any of the Vichy soldiers that were captured were given back almost immediately, and same with Americans.
Thank you. I think we have time for just one more question.
Okay.
We'll take another one from Mark Snedden in Littleton. So he says, I am the son of a World War II medic who survived 3 years moving up the Philippines and Japanese islands. I had an uncle that served in the Third Army with Patton in North Africa and Italy, and an uncle who was a minesweeper who survived Normandy. Neither his dad nor uncles had the fondest memories of Patton MacArthur, and at times even Roosevelt, but it did allow him many hours of stories about the war from their perspectives. He's now a historian and says he's fully aware of the complex benefits of multiple front war, but he would like to be interested in your perspective of the conflict between Allied generals. Is this as contentious as depicted in books and movies? Was Montgomery as predictable and/or incompetent as he is sometimes portrayed?
Oh, that's great. A great question. Honestly, I think they were all irascible. We think that all the generals must have got along for a common effort. The funny part is I have been a personal assistant to some general of very high rank, and I was amazed at how there's rivalries and such that go around. So Patton was very hard to get along with. Bradley called him an odd duck. Eisenhower liked Patton. He knew him as a captain. He worked with him during the First World War or after in the 1920s. And somebody like Patton was just extremely difficult to get along with, but he was a good fighter, not irreplaceable. I think that's a myth. If Patton had died of a heart attack in Casablanca, somebody like General Truscott would have been very good. Mark Clark, the same thing. He only allowed photographers to take his photo from his left side. He said that was his good side. And he required the press to always have every press release as Mark Clark's Fifth Army. So you can see there's these personalities involved. Montgomery is a more complex character, and there's a British historian, military writer named James Holland, and I was reading him in the past, and I thought he really brought something out about Montgomery. Americans tend to say Montgomery was really so hard to work with. Well, he was. Montgomery was a brilliant general in his own way, and he understood how he could lead British soldiers, especially where the majority were not volunteers. This was a new army. These young men didn't necessarily have the zeal. They had to be convinced why they were there. That's why Montgomery would go around. Montgomery had almost, we would say today, some sort of psychological issue where he just wasn't self-aware. He didn't realize how irritating he could be. But that doesn't take away from the fact that he was a very good operational leader. Now, in summary, though, why is Eisenhower considered so successful and ends up being one of the most successful officers in the war? It's because Eisenhower, his ego was very controllable, and he never lets his ego get out of hand. And Marshall understood that. Franklin Roosevelt understood that. And so they could give that responsibility to Eisenhower without it really getting to his head. And he was able to get along and get the British and Americans to work together. Patton couldn't have done that. Montgomery couldn't have done that. And actually, Mark Clark, there's no way he could have been the Supreme Allied Commander. There's very few. I'm not even sure if Marshall would have been that good at it. Eisenhower did a very good job. And sometimes, as a leader, you have to have a small ego.
Thank you, Bart.
Well, I really appreciate, I wish I could see everyone in the audience. I look forward to the day where we can sail together. I learn as much from the audience as I hope I impart to you. And this week is a perfect week for us to remember the veterans of both all our countries, of the sacrifice they made, that great generation, so that they could liberate Europe and enjoy the freedoms we have today. So thank you, everybody. Good evening, and we'll see you in the future.